The real story. Horror. Only. At Mr. Scare.
I don't remember everything about my childhood. Most of my early memories are covered in a hazy fog, with only the truly frightening or painful events lingering in my mind to this day. That year, I was 6 years old. It was 1978, and my family had just moved into a new house. Back then, I was too young to understand why we had to move, but I remember very clearly the tense silence in the car as we drove to our new home. I sat in the back seat, clutching my teddy bear, staring out the car window. The scenery flashed by quickly. Empty fields, scattered wooden houses, and finally, the neighborhood we were going to call home. My father, Richard, was a quiet man. He didn't talk much, but there was something about the way he gripped the steering wheel that made me feel he was worried. My mother, Carol, kept turning her head to look at me, then back to the front. I could sense the unease in her eyes. No one said a word. That felt strange to me because when we had moved before, I vaguely remembered one move when I was very little. My mother was always the one to reassure me, telling me about all the wonderful things awaiting us in our new home. But this time she didn't. We pulled up in front of a 2-story wooden house with sparse patches of grass in the front yard. It wasn't an ugly house, but there was something unsettling about the way it stood silently in the neighborhood. This house had been vacant for a long time before we moved in. I'd overheard my parents talking about it a few times. The previous owners moved out years ago, my mother said. So who sold the house to us? I asked curiously. My parents exchanged glances, then my mother replied, a real estate company bought it a long time ago. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, when I look back, I wonder, why had it been empty for so long, yet still so well maintained? On the very first day, I hated that house. Not because it was old or strange, but because there was something in the basement. My mother told me I wasn't allowed to go down there. It was a dark room with a thick wooden door and a large lock. But what terrified me wasn't the door itself. It was the feeling I got whenever I stood near it. Like someone was standing on the other side, silently listening to my every breath. Strange things started happening from the very first night. The kitchen cabinet doors were wide open the next morning, even though my mother had checked everything before going to bed. Footsteps echoed down the hallway at night, though my parents insisted it was just the old wood creaking. Objects shifted slightly, not much, just a few centimeters, but enough for me to notice. My parents told me I was imagining things, but I knew I wasn't. One night, I woke up because I heard a noise, a very faint sound, like someone moving around in the kitchen. I listened closely. Thump, thump, thump. Slow and deliberate, but clear as day. At first I thought it was my mom or dad getting up for a glass of water, but then I realized their bedroom door was still shut. So who was downstairs? I didn't have the courage to check. I pulled the blanket over my head, trying not to make a sound. But I knew someone was there. Then the footsteps stopped, but that wasn't the end. A new sound emerged. Breathing. Slow. Heavy. Right outside my bedroom door. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning I told my mother. I heard someone in the house, I said, my voice trembling. She looked at me with concern but simply patted my head. You must have been dreaming, Ethan. But I knew I wasn't dreaming, and I knew someone was there. A few days later, while I was playing in the hallway, I stopped suddenly. Something felt wrong. I looked down the hall. The basement door, which had always been locked, was wide open. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The basement door, it was open. Not just slightly ajar. It had been pushed wide enough for someone to walk through. I swallowed hard, my throat dry and scratchy. Mom had locked that door. I saw her lock it the first day we moved in. How could it open on its own? A chill ran down my spine. Someone had opened it. But who? My parents never left the basement door open. Dad even told me never to go down there. So, if it wasn't them, I bit my lip. I should run and call Mom. But my legs felt glued to the floor. A part of me wanted to know what was down there. A deep, endless darkness. Old wooden stairs leading down into the black void. The darkness was too thick, too silent, as if it were waiting for someone to step in. Something was down there, and I had the feeling it was looking at me. I took a step back, and then a sound came from below. Thud. A very soft, faint sound, but it wasn't the creak of wood. It sounded like a footstep on a cold floor. Someone was down there. I ran. My legs carried me as fast as they could toward the living room, where Mom was cleaning. "Mom! Mom!" She turned around, surprise mixed with a hint of worry on her face. "What's wrong, Ethan?" "The basement. The door is open. I heard something down there." Dad had just come in from the garage, frowning. He looked at Mom, then at me. "You probably just imagined it, Ethan." "No, I saw the door open. I heard someone down there." Mom and Dad exchanged glances. There was something in their eyes, not the concern I expected, but annoyance. Dad sighed. "All right, I'll check." He walked over to the door, Mom following closely behind. I stayed behind her, too scared to get any closer. Dad stared down the stairs for a moment, then flipped the light switch. The basement light flickered on, a pale yellow glow, not strong enough to illuminate the entire space. Dad slowly started down. I could hear his footsteps on the old wooden stairs. Mom stood at the top, tension clear in her eyes. Dad disappeared into the darkness. I held my breath, listening. A long, heavy silence. Then, after a while, Dad's voice echoed. "There's no one here." Dad came back up, brushing dust off his pants. "Nothing. It's probably just an old door popping open on its own." I didn't believe him. I heard footsteps. I felt someone watching me from the darkness. But Dad didn't say more. He locked the door again, muttered something to Mom, and walked away. Mom looked at me, gently ruffling my hair. "It's okay, Ethan. Don't worry about it." But I knew something was wrong. Strange things kept happening. At night, I heard footsteps coming from the basement. The lights in the house would flicker on and off by themselves. Once, I woke up in the middle of the night to find my closet door wide open, but my parents still didn't believe me. "You're just imagining things, Ethan." But I wasn't. I knew someone was in the house. I knew something was watching us. One night I woke up to go to the bathroom. The house was pitch dark, except for a faint glow from the street light outside the window. As I walked past the living room, I froze. Someone was standing in the corner of the room. A tall figure, perfectly still, like a statue. My chest tightened, my hand gripping the doorframe. The figure didn't move, but I knew he was looking at me. The darkness hid his face, but I could feel his eyes, cold, focused. I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, paralyzed with fear. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the man stepped into the shadows and vanished. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just stood there, trembling, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. But I hadn't. I didn't tell my parents. I knew they wouldn't believe me. But I knew he was there. And now, I was starting to understand. The previous owner never left. He still lives here, right beneath us, in the basement. After that night when I saw the shadowy figure in the living room, this house no longer felt like home. It felt like a trap, a giant trap, and my family and I were just prey waiting to be hunted. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but strange things kept happening. Furniture was moved every morning, a chair pulled slightly away from the table, a cupboard door left ajar. Mom started complaining that someone had been secretly opening the kitchen cabinets at night. I heard faint tapping noises coming from inside the walls every evening. Once, I saw Dad startle awake in the middle of the night, staring out the bedroom door. Something had woken him up. I knew my parents were slowly realizing that something wasn't right. But they didn't say it out loud. And I hated how adults always pretended nothing was wrong. That day was a Saturday. Dad was fixing the pipes, Mom went grocery shopping, and I was home alone. When I stepped into the kitchen to grab some milk, I suddenly felt something strange. I heard a noise. Not loud, not clear, but it was right beneath me. Tap, 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 as if someone was lightly knocking on wood. I stood still, listening. The sound stopped. I looked down at the floor. Something was under the kitchen floor. I knelt down, placing my hand on the wood. Cold, hard. Then I noticed something strange. Between the floor tiles was a very thin line. I touched it. It wasn't a crack. It was a gap. I swallowed hard. Something underneath? A hidden room? I tried to lift it, but it was too heavy. Then it hit me. The previous owner. Could this be the real entrance to the basement? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. If there was a secret room beneath the kitchen, then who was living there? The previous owner? Why was he hiding? And why didn't my parents say anything about it? A scarier question crept into my mind. Could it be that they already knew? Around 2 a.m., I woke up with a start to a loud noise coming from the kitchen. Bang! I held my breath. This time, it wasn't the faint tapping sounds. It was louder, clearer, as if someone had just shoved something heavy onto the floor. I crept out of bed, slowly opening my door. The house was pitch black. But from the kitchen, I saw a faint light spilling out. A door was open, not the basement door, the floor door in the kitchen. My heart raced wildly. I couldn't move. I didn't want to get closer, but I couldn't look away either. The darkness beneath the floor was thick, like a bottomless pit. And then, something crawled up from it. I saw the hand first, a thin, scarred hand. Then, a face, the face of a man. He rose, bit by bit, emerging from the shadows. My throat tightened. I couldn't scream. The man stared straight at me. His eyes were empty, yet they held something terrifying. He didn't say a word, just stood there, watching me. Then suddenly, he smiled. A twisted, mysterious smile. And I understood something. He didn't want to hurt us. He wanted us to stay. He wanted us to become a part of this place. And he was waiting for something. I ran back to my room, pulling the blanket over my head, my heart pounding. I didn't dare fall asleep. All night, I just listened. No more sounds. The next morning, I woke up thinking it was all just a nightmare. But when I stepped into the kitchen, the floor door was still slightly open, and there were footprints on the tiles. Wet footprints, as if someone had just stepped up from somewhere damp and cold. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know who he was and why he was still here. I had to go down to the basement. I had to find out the truth for myself. Even though I knew that once I stepped down there would be no way back. I stood in front of the floor door in the kitchen, my heart pounding. It was still slightly ajar, like an invitation from the darkness below. A musty smell wafted up from the basement, an old, foul odor, but mixed within it was another scent, the metallic scent, like blood. I swallowed hard. I couldn't ignore this any longer. I had to know the truth. I reached out and flipped the kitchen light switch. A faint beam of light spilled down onto the old wooden stairs. With each step I took, the wood creaked. Cold. The air down here was strangely cold. And then, when I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw it. The basement was larger than I'd expected. Stained walls, a low ceiling, and a single bare light bulb dangling from the center of the room. There was a long wooden table, covered with a pile of old papers. Next to it, a rusty metal cabinet, tightly shut. But what made me freeze was the old bed pushed against the wall. Someone had been living here. The blanket and pillow still held the shape of a body that had once rested there. A small chair sat beside it, with an old picture frame on top. I picked it up. A family. The man I had seen last night. But he wasn't alone. He was photographed with a woman and 2 children. I shivered. Why was he still here? I looked over at the table. There was an old notebook. I opened it, and shaky handwriting appeared before my eyes. March 12, 1975. They left me behind, but I can't leave this house. It's ours. Mine. They don't know I'm still here. May 24th, 1978. A new family has arrived, a couple and their little boy. I saw them through the vent. They seem kind, but I can't let them take this house. I have to do something. November 2nd, 1978. The boy looks so much like my son. I can't let him fall into the same tragedy as my family. I have to protect him, even if they don't understand. I trembled. He had been here all this time, and he had been watching us, not with the intent to harm us, but to protect us. I slammed the notebook shut. I heard footsteps. Someone was coming down the stairs. I held my breath, pressing myself into a dark corner. The silhouette of the man appeared on the steps. This time, he was no longer hiding in the shadows. He stood there, looking straight at me. Our eyes met. He didn't say a word, just sighed, a sigh filled with sorrow. Then he walked over to the metal cabinet. He took out another photograph. He stared at it for a long time, then handed it to me. A photo of 2 children, his 2 children. But on the back of the photo, there was a line of text. I couldn't protect them. I won't let that happen again. I didn't understand. I only knew one thing. He didn't intend to harm us. But why was he hiding here? And why had his family disappeared? I wanted to ask him so many things. But at that moment I heard the sound of the door opening upstairs in the kitchen. Mom was home. The man flinched. He turned away, stepping back into the darkness, disappearing through a small door at the back of the basement. I couldn't do anything. I could only watch. That passage. Where did it lead? That night, I lay in bed, clutching the photo. His family. They were gone. But he was still here. He wanted to protect us. But from what? I didn't know. But I knew one thing. This house held more secrets than we thought. And I wasn't ready to uncover them all. I couldn't sleep. The photograph of the 2 children in my hand felt like a haunting reminder. Who were they? What had happened to them? And why was the house's former owner still here? I turned the photo over. The words on the back still lingered in my mind. I couldn't protect them. I won't let it happen again. I could feel the pain in those words. This man wasn't insane. He had lost his family. But why had he chosen to stay? Something wasn't right. I had to find out. The next morning, I waited for my parents to leave before returning to the basement. The floor door was shut tight, as if last night had only been a nightmare. But no, I had seen him. I had held the photograph in my hands. I pushed open the door and descended into the basement, this time carrying a flashlight. Its beam cut through the damp air, casting eerie shadows on the stained walls. I found the small door where the man had disappeared the night before. It wasn't locked. I took a deep breath, then stepped inside. Beyond the door was a narrow, pitch-black corridor. The air was thick with dampness. The walls were peeling, and a light touch left dust clinging to my fingers. The passageway led deeper underground. The cold sent chills through me. At the end of the hallway was a small room, a wooden table, an old lamp, and scattered papers covering the floor. I stepped closer. The pages were filled with frantic, messy handwriting. I shuddered as I read them. They took them from me. They said I wasn't fit to be a father. I tried to protect them, but they didn't understand. I waited. I couldn't leave. This is our home. The words were scrawled in desperation, as if written by a broken man. He had children once, but someone had taken them away. Had he been forced to leave his family? A loose sheet of paper drifted to the floor at my feet. I picked it up. I won't let it happen again. I scanned the room. In the corner stood an old wardrobe. I hesitated, then pulled it open. Inside were children's clothes, old toys. Everything was covered in dust. But one thing made my heart stop. A small jacket. One that looked eerily familiar. I recognized it immediately. This jacket. It was mine. I spun around. I was no longer alone. The man stood in the doorway. His eyes were full of emotion. Not anger, but a deep, crushing sorrow. He looked at me, then at the jacket in my hands. I never meant to harm you. His voice was low, heavy with pain. I didn't dare move. He stepped closer and spoke again. You look just like my son, just like him. He sat down, clasping his hands together. Then he began to speak. Years ago, I lived here with my wife and 2 children. I loved them more than anything in the world. But then, there was an accident. His voice caught in his throat. The house caught fire. I couldn't save them. They blamed me. They said it was my fault. They took me away, but I came back. Because this is our home. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what to say. He continued, I only wanted to protect you. I couldn't let you suffer the same fate as my children. I was starting to understand. He wasn't a madman. He was a grieving father, haunted by his past, desperately trying to protect another family. But why did he think we were in danger? I swallowed hard and whispered, my voice unsteady. Protect us. From what? The man stared at me for a long moment. Then he pointed upward. There is something in this house. A shiver crawled up my spine. Not me, he said. Something else. I didn't understand what he meant, but I knew one thing. This house wasn't normal, and I had to uncover the truth before it was too late. I stared at the man. His words sent a cold chill through my entire body. There's something in this house. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew he wasn't lying. I'd felt it ever since we moved in. The strange noises at night, the shadows flickering at the corner of my eye, the feeling of being watched when I was alone. But if it wasn't him, then who was it? Suddenly, footsteps echoed above us. I jumped, my heart pounding. The man looked up too, his eyes darkening. Did you hear that? I nodded, my pulse racing. Heavy, slow footsteps, like someone dragging something across the floor. Your parents aren't home, so who's up there? I didn't want to think about the answer. The man stood abruptly. We have to go. I stepped back. Go where? You can't stay here, not in this house. He grabbed my arm, but I pulled away. I'm not leaving my parents. He stared at me for a long moment, then whispered, if you stay, they won't be your parents anymore. I didn't understand what he meant, but the fear in his eyes was undeniable. I had no choice. I had to go upstairs and see for myself. I crept up the stairs, moving as quietly as I could. The silence was deafening. I scanned the living room. No one. But my parents' bedroom door was wide open. I remembered clearly. I had closed it before going to the basement. My steps grew slower. Something was in that room. I pushed the door open. The window was ajar, the curtains billowing from the cold breeze. The mirror on the wall reflected the room. But something was wrong. I saw a man standing in the mirror. When I turned around, no one was there. A chill ran down my spine. Was I imagining things? No. The man was still staring at me through the mirror. Suddenly, the glass trembled. The figure slowly turned to face me. His eyes were hollow, endless black voids. His mouth stretched open unnaturally wide as if trying to say something. "Boy, go back to the basement." I couldn't move. He wasn't a ghost. He was real. And he was in my house. I spun around and bolted, my heart racing like it would burst. I sprinted back to the basement, where the old man was waiting. "He's in the house," I shouted. The man looked at me for a long time, then nodded. "I know." "You know? Then why aren't you doing something?" He didn't answer immediately. "Do you remember what I told you? You can't stay here." He met my eyes, his gaze filled with sorrow. "He's not me." I trembled. "Then, who is he?" The man lowered his head. "He's been here long before me. He's the one who took my family." A wave of dread washed over me. He was the one who killed the man's wife and children. Footsteps echoed again, closer this time. The man gripped my shoulders. "You have to run now." "What about you?" "I'll stay." I didn't want to leave him, but he pushed me toward the escape door. "Go, I'll hold him off." I hesitated, then I ran. I burst out of the basement, stumbling onto the grass outside. Inside the house, the lights flickered, then went dark. I heard screams, agonizing, echoing from the basement. Then, silence. Absolute silence. I sat there, frozen, my eyes locked on the house. What happened in there? I never found out. My parents came home hours later, finding me trembling outside. They asked what had happened. I simply said, someone was in the house. We moved out the very next morning. The house was abandoned, forever, and I never went back. But every time I have a nightmare, I hear his voice. "I protected you, but is he really gone?" I don't know, and that's the scariest part. Thank you for watching until the end of the video. Please hit follow to support the channel, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next video. See you soon, and goodbye.